Hello, Kent State University graduate students. I'm delighted to be here with you today talking about the ethics of the use of story. Let's start by acknowledging that story is extremely powerful and story is extremely persuasive. Stories connect with and surface people's memories. Stories are an incredibly powerful tool for getting people to visualize a situation, to actually imagine themselves within it, and to actually viscerally gain a sense of an experience. And true stories are about a person's unique experience. When somebody shares a story about something that happens to them, they're sharing a piece of themselves. Something similar may have happened to you, but exactly what happened to this person, the exact turn of events, the way that they felt about something, the way that they experienced it, the way that they thought about it, that's incredibly unique to them. And because of that, it's really a part of that person. And because stories are so powerful, and because personal stories are wholly owned, you have an incredibly important ethical obligation in how you actually go forward and use these stories and apply them in your business work. Whether you're asking for stories to better understand an organizational challenge or to use in an advertising or an advocacy campaign, your goal is to empower, not to exploit, the person that is sharing his or her story. Let's explore some of the ways that you can embark on the ethical use of story. To start, you have to be perfectly honest about why you are setting out to use story. What are your goals and what are your organization's goals? And then go one step further. Ask yourself not just how you and your organization are going to benefit from the use of this story, but ask how this person sharing their story can benefit them. What's in it for this person, and what's going to happen to them, and what do they stand to gain from sharing the story? Think about whether your goal is to elicit more stories. Are you looking to share stories so that you hear more? Sometimes an advocacy campaign will do this, or a nonprofit organization, for instance. They may be looking for stories about how people were denied health insurance, and so they'll ask for some stories in the hope that more people will hear those stories and more stories will come in. Oftentimes, consumer goods or products, companies that make those will go out and ask for stories from customers about positive experiences and how they like the good or the service, so that they could hear more stories from other customers about how they like the service. Think about whether you're setting out to elicit stories and share them so that you can share organizational knowledge. Think about whether you're trying to spark a conversation. Do you want the people who are reading, listening, or hearing the stories that you share to react to them? Do you want them to take some sort of action? Do you want them to build a community based on hearing these stories? Whatever it is that you're setting out to do, you need to be absolutely explicit about what you're doing, and you need to make good on it. In other words, if you want to gather more stories, make sure you have a mechanism in place that you can indeed gather those stories. If you want to spark some action, make sure that you're providing the resources so that people can take that action that you want them to take. You want to make sure that you're absolutely being transparent and clear about your goals. My colleague Cynthia Kurtz and her colleague David Snowden offer 3 rules for the ethical use of narrative in an organization. The first rule is to always declare up front the use of narrative techniques, no stealth story work. The second is if you are asked any question about what sort of narrative intervention you are doing, such as instructing executives in how to tell stories for cultural change, answer honestly. And their third is to appoint an independent arbiter for any dispute over the use of narrative techniques in an organization. If you respect the story and the person that's sharing the story, I actually ask you to think of 3 other techniques, 3 other conditions that you want to have in place when you start out using story. Number 1, make sure that nobody is coerced into sharing their story. Number 2, make sure that people are fully listened to when they're sharing their story. And number 3, make sure that you're creating an environment where the person can share their story that's a positive environment. You may have noticed that I am refraining from using the word story collection or to collect stories. I'm also not talking about storytellers and people telling their stories. I think that those terms, collection and telling, are incredibly transactional. And I don't think that story should be treated as a commodity. I don't think that story is something that you take from somebody and give to somebody else. And I think that this happens all too often, especially in the nonprofit and development field, when a story from somebody who is poor and afflicted or vulnerable is taken from them and offered to somebody else for a monetary reward, for a donation. So story is not a commodity. And even if you're not working in the nonprofit field or the development field, you still have to make sure that you treat story not as a commodity, that you make sure that you treat story respectfully in all of the work that you're doing. True narrative intelligence respects the story sharer and respects the story and understands that that story is a part of the person that cannot and should not be taken away. Several organizations are doing really wonderful work about eliciting stories and sharing them publicly for human rights goals or for advocacy work and for other issue campaigns. And I urge you to take a look at them. And those organizations, you can check out their websites and how they're sharing stories. Those organizations include witness.org, the innocenceproject.org, and forexhale.org. Some of what we need to know about how to use stories ethically in our work in organizations comes from a general understanding of our own humanity, and some of it from an understanding of our emotional intelligence and from your burgeoning narrative intelligence. And of course, the nuts and bolts of what we've learned about how to do ethical story sharing comes from the field of journalism. People who have professionally been gathering and sharing stories for a very, very long time. And if you want to find out more about transparency issues and issues about objectivity and the role of the press, I urge you to go to pointner.org, which has terrific resources. Of course, entirely new challenges are being presented by technology and innovation. The traditional fourth estate, the real traditional journalism and the newsroom, is getting smaller, while the fifth estate, the idea of citizen journalists and bloggers, people who are collecting information and sharing it and sharing stories from various websites, that's getting larger. We're all media now. As a student, you very well might be producing and sharing stories through your own media dissemination. Corporations, not-for-profits, governments are in the business now of sharing stories with the public. When you graduate, most likely you're going to be taking work where you will be producing media and sharing those stories. And we're incredibly challenged now to be working to incredibly high ethical standards as we go forward, and we're faced with technology and innovation and the new ways in which stories can both be shared and taken beyond the context that we think about them, our original thought, and how they can be shared beyond that. Wise people say that there are always three stories. There's the story that we tell, there's the story that we hear, and then there's the third story, which is the truth. I'd like to add a fourth to that, and that's the story that we're not hearing. And it's incredibly important as you go forward and you want to work to high ethical standards to think about what stories are you not hearing, and do you have a responsibility to surface those stories, to make sure that all voices can be heard and all voices are able to share their stories. Also, I want you to think about whether you're going to publicly present and label the stories that you're sharing? And if you do label them, how will that context affect how people are going to understand the stories? For instance, if you were to take a collection of stories and break them up and say, here are stories from African Americans, or here are stories from women, or here are stories from college graduates, what is that doing to your audience's perception of those stories? How are you changing the context simply by putting a label on those stories? When you label, when you label a story, you can be denying it such details as emotion and other specifics of context, and thus you're denying true understanding of that story. The Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie talks about the danger of a single story and the harm that can result from power imbalances when people set out to share other people's stories. She says, how they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Murad Brigadi writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do so is to tell their story and start with, secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans, but not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African states, and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. I urge you to watch her entire 20-minute presentation on TED.com. It's called The Danger of a Single Story. And I want you to be aware of other power imbalances, of people feeling that they have no recourse but to say yes to you when you ask them if they would share their story with you. Perhaps you're seeking to use a person's story in an advertising campaign or in a marketing campaign, and you're offering them money for that story. Or perhaps you're even offering an all-expenses-paid trip so that they could come and share their story and you could obtain it from them. That in and of itself might constitute a power imbalance, and I want you to think about that. And sometimes you may be working with stigmatized populations. In these cases, you have a special responsibility, not only to the story, but also to the story sharer. Might you know more about how that person might be affected professionally or personally by sharing that story? Might you know more about how their sharing that story could actually harm them in the future and how it might be used against them? Think about whether you need to provide for that person's safety. Make sure that that person really understands and has a sense of informed consent. Think about how the person who's sharing the story might lose control over that story, especially when we're talking about super public places like YouTube. I talked before about how a story can be taken out of context and shared over and over again in a different context, especially digitally. And you need to be incredibly aware of that and help the person who's about to share his or her story either understand that or help them protect against that. Now, the pendulum can swing way too far in the other direction as well. I've heard from lots of really well-meaning nonprofit executives, oh, we can't possibly go out and share this person's story. This person's too vulnerable and too powerless. Well, that's a power imbalance too. By claiming that you know better than the other person, by claiming that the person is incapable of sharing their story and would never want to, you're making assumptions, and that's incredibly wrong as well. What you need to do is take a good look at your informed consent documents. Better yet, have a professional take a look at your informed consent documents. See if there's a way that people can think about all the different ways in which their stories can be shared. Maybe the person sharing his or her story would want to do so anonymously. Maybe they would want to share it only with a specific audience or through a specific medium or in a specific way or for a specific amount of time. These are all options that you can offer the story sharer, and you could ask the story sharer themselves what they think about. Throughout this course, you have learned that stories are not just child's play. Stories are incredibly personal, stories are incredibly powerful, and stories are incredibly persuasive. Stories in an organization can affect great change, and stories can change the way that a person perceives of another person, even the way that they perceive of the world. As a narrative leader, you are called upon to work to the highest ethical standards in the way in which you use story in an organization. Make sure that you respect the story and the teller and the way in which you go about eliciting and sharing that story. Thank you.